All right, folks, welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. Today is Stoic Saturday, and I'm delighted to have Bill talking to us about the chapter on Act the Opposite. We've been going through this handbook chapter by chapter, not all chapters, but the good thing is that Greg Lopez has been very gracious. He is doing 6 of these chapters. He has selected actually 13 of the 52 weeks as being kind of critical exercises that give you a very good, fair flavor of the entire book. And then he's doing 6 of them himself. And I have other people like this group in Philadelphia has been studying the book chapter by chapter. They're all the way up to 31. So Bill and Joe and others of that chapter. So I'm working with them so today, Bill is going to lead. Bill, take it away.
Okay, thanks, Rakant. So we are up to chapter 31 in Philadelphia, and we have been having some very good discussions about the handbook and the exercises. So today we'll talk about week 10 in the handbook, about act the opposite. So this lesson about acting the opposite is about how doing the opposite of what we may be accustomed to doing can help us grow in wisdom and happiness. So the issue here is that we commonly think certain things make us happy, but do they really and truly make us happy? And this exercise is sort of directed at making us realize more what really makes us happy. Many people think that accumulating material things, wealth, fame, those kind of things are what really makes us happy. But as we'll see, and we'll present some reasons why this is the case, that is really not so. And here in this chapter, it uses the example of Asha, who is attracted to material things. In her case, she went on a trip to Prada to get all the latest designs, thinking that would make her happier. But, you know, when you mindlessly pursue desires like this, and, you know, you perhaps think that they'll produce long-term happiness, they don't really do that. And they don't even contribute to living a good life or even a pleasant life. And the same principle has to do with things that we avoid, that we don't want to have in our lives. So there's a quote in this chapter by Seneca. So let me read this quote now. Seneca says, "How much better to follow a straight course and attain a goal where the words pleasant and honorable have the same meaning. This end will be possible for us if we understand that there are 2 classes of objects that either attract us or repel us. We are attracted by such things as riches, pleasures, beauty, ambition, and other such coaxing and pleasing objects. We are repelled by toil, death, pain, disgrace, or lives of greater frugality. We ought therefore to train ourselves so that we may avoid a fear of the one or a desire for the other. Let us fight in the opposite fashion. Let us retreat from the objects that allure and rouse ourselves to meet the objects that attack." So Seneca is saying that we can train ourselves not to pursue things that we enjoy and to actually actively prepare to face things that we avoid. So one thing that the authors mention in this chapter is the idea of winter training that ancient soldiers used to engage in to prepare for battle during the winter, which was not the fighting season. But they sort of did the opposite by avoiding things they dislike, um, such as the hard work of battle, maybe even the pain of battle, maybe even as much as death. They prepared for the opposite of avoiding things they dislike, such as those things. So the idea here is that Stoic training isn't just about withstanding adversity, but preparing for it during the times that are good, although it's not pleasant to do so. So these soldiers would probably have rather do other things in the winter than prepare for battle. But in order to prepare themselves for battle, they endured certain things while preparing for battle so they would be more ready when the time came. Another point here is that what is enjoyable or pleasant, so, preparing for battle in the winter was no doubt not a pleasant thing, but what is enjoyable or pleasant is really a value judgment and not an objective fact of the world. And one thing that is emphasized here this week is that we can change our judgments about our value judgments about things through practice. And we can change our value judgments as to what we consider enjoyable or what we consider the opposite of that. Maybe I can give an example. Okay, we're in summer now, it's hot. Maybe on a hot day, you want to eat a gallon of ice cream or something like that because you think it's enjoyable. But if you step back and think about that a little bit, you might realize that if you eat, so much as a gallon of ice cream, you may be contributing to, diabetes or obesity or something like that. And if you look at it like that, something like eating ice cream wouldn't seem to be so enjoyable. You can change your desire to have this ice cream. So we do have the power to change our judgments about things and thus change our desire about things. Also, the idea of Stoicism is also to grow in virtue, to act with moderation and not go so far as to eat like a gallon of ice cream. You're exercising the virtue of moderation. So the same goes for other things as well. And while things like pleasures, like a gallon of ice cream or riches and things like that are often preferred by us, they are the kind of things that really should not be pursued at the cost of virtue, because that's the most important thing. These things outside of virtue are not really good, and in the long run don't really make us happy. And the chapter talks about the idea of the hedonic treadmill, which many people are on. With the hedonic treadmill, think about a treadmill, you're running in place, you're not really going anywhere. And the same principle applies to when you're going after external things like material goods or various pleasures. You're sort of running after these things, thinking that they will make you happy when they really don't. For example, let's say you buy a car thinking it'll make you happy. Well, maybe you'll have some happy feelings for a little while, but then they wear off, and then you have to buy something else to make you happy or do something else. And it's kind of a never-ending cycle, and you're never really satisfied, and you're never truly happy. You're just running in place, chasing something, thinking it's the answer to your perhaps unhappiness, and it's really not accomplishing that. It's sort of like an up and down cycle. And there's really no peace of mind with that kind of pursuit. So the exercise in this chapter then is about trying to get off the hedonic treadmill. And it's described as a two-step process. First, realizing that what we superficially think is pleasant and is good and will make us happy is not really. What appears to be pleasant or good may not be that way. And the second step is to realize that internalizing this idea, when you act on this, you can actually move away from objects that you are attracted to, and motivate yourself to actually meet objects that you may be averse to. And when you're doing this, you are taking a step in the direction of wisdom, happiness, we might say true long-term happiness and virtue. So very briefly, that is sort of the lesson in this chapter. And before we get into the exercise itself, I ask if you have any questions that you would like to ask about the lesson.
Okay, wonderful, folks. Thank you very much, Bill, for the introduction. Now, as usual, you can line up for asking questions as well as making comments. If you have read the chapter and you would like to say something, this is a good time to say something. So we have 4 rules that work very well. You type exclamation mark to speak. Number 2, keep on topic. Number 3, be brief. And number 4, be courteous. All right, so with that, it's going to be Shelley first, followed by Leslie. Shelley, go ahead.
Hey, thanks, Shrikant. And thanks, Bill. I'm relatively new to Stoicism, although I do think I've been practicing some Stoic ideology unbeknownst to myself just due to personality. But my question is, you mentioned happiness a lot, and that I'd like you to expound on that a little bit, because it surprises me that Stoicism would be something that you would use to get happy. And my personal opinion is no matter what you do to try and feel happy, you're going to feel sorely disappointed. And it seems to me that there would be other words that describe a more fulfilled life, right? Like maybe contentment with joy or something along those lines. And I'm wondering if you could expound on more of using the word happiness in conjunction with Stoicism, because maybe I'm misunderstanding what you're implying.
Now, that's a very good question. So the conventional view of happiness usually has to do with, having pleasant emotions, feeling cheer or something like that, having those a lot. So in Stoicism, as well as in many ancient philosophies, happiness is defined as sort of eudaimonia. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that word, but eudaimonia is the word that's usually translated as happiness. And really, it's not exactly what we think of happiness today. So eudaimonia is more like flourishing or thriving, or I like to think of it as living in the best way that a human being can live. It of course would result in having positive emotions, the kind of emotions that you would prefer to have. But it's not that, in a sense, things like the positive emotions that come from eudaimonia or the tranquility or serenity, it is more or less a byproduct of living in a certain way, living according to reason, living, applying rationality to living the best life you can live. That kind of thing is really what they mean when the Stoics talk about happiness, and that's eudaimonia. And that's a tricky word because it doesn't really have a very nice, precise definition. And I've heard different people and different schools of thought talk about eudaimonia in slightly different ways. But so the idea is, some of the Stoics defined it as like living a smoothly flowing life, or something along those lines. But fulfilling, sometimes it's referred to, as you said, a fulfilling life. So it's one of those words that's kind of difficult to translate directly, but you know, you perhaps can get a feel for what they're talking about. Yes.
I would like to add one thing. I mean, I studied these great ideas, you know, great books of the Western world. And it is really fascinating to see how meanings of the words change over time. So happiness at Greek time meant something completely different than our concept of art, for example, meant completely different. It was both these, or concept of beauty, these were very large concepts that enveloped everything that we did. And unfortunately, those same concepts of happiness used in the modern times are much more narrower concept. So the concept of eudaimonia, or happiness loosely translated, is kind of closer to flourishing, well-being. It's like a total effect of doing the right thing. So virtue is a key part of it. Like today's concept of happiness, virtue it's like an afterthought. Whereas there, in this concept, the Greek concept of eudaimonia, virtue is a critical part of it. And then the idea that you need to achieve values everywhere, in all your life. So it's a much more kind of a well-being, flourishing, and all-encompassing concept. Next up is Leslie, Bruce, and Joe. Leslie, go ahead.
Hi, thanks. The idea of what we need, our desires we need to avoid, it's more straightforward, as you said, because we're a little bit of a materialistic society. So it's easier to understand the avoiding the material. But you mentioned actually seeking exposure to even material objects to which we have an aversion, and that concept seemed tricky to me. Maybe my aversions are people who would label or criticize or things like that, and so I don't even know if I should be deliberately exposing myself to them. But specifically, what's an object to which people have aversion that they should deliberately expose themselves?
Okay. So this kind of reminds me of what is called exposure therapy in modern psychotherapy. Maybe to give an example, let's just say you're afraid of spiders. You have anxiety and fear when you see a spider. So you have an aversion to it. When you see a spider, you want to move away from it, get away from it. Well, with this type of thing, it's about training yourself to do the opposite of what you would normally do. And maybe when you see a spider, you could start out by maybe taking one step toward the spider to get closer to it, to try to, get rid of the idea that spiders are something dangerous and something that should be feared. And with practice, you can do that gradually. You can practice stepping closer to the spider and closer and closer, until finally, maybe you could hold the spider in your hand. I'm not talking about a tarantula or a scorpion or something, but, just a harmless spider. And you can get used to it so that you no longer have that aversion, to that spider. And that can be used for other things that you could be averse to. I mean, it could be, a whole lot of things that people are commonly averse to. People who may speak in a certain way that is seemingly unpleasant, or someone who's very critical. You can practice exposing yourself to that, so you're able to sort of have a different viewpoint regarding it, and it doesn't cause negative emotions for you. I don't know if that explained it. Was that?
Yes, thanks. And there's more discussion to have, but yes, thank you.
Okay, you're welcome.
Thanks, Bill. Next up is Bruce. He requests me to read out his question. He asks, do you think that training for battle in good times could map onto athletic training in general, where the athlete in good times pushes himself to deal with the pain of competition a little each day in preparation for the competition?
Yeah, that almost sounds like almost sounds like very much the same thing as the training of soldiers. Yes. I don't know if anyone has seen that show on TV, The Last Dance, about Michael Jordan and basketball. I just started watching that, and his fame as a basketball player, his ability. This is how I kind of thought of this idea of winter training when I was watching it, because he became the great person he was, the great basketball player he was, because of the extraordinary amount of training he did. Maybe he was actually training, so far that it was not really pleasant. He was pushing himself, but his values were that he wanted to win and do what was necessary to win. So he would train during the off season, for the regular season, and he would be prepared and ready. And he was successful like perhaps no other basketball player in history.
Thanks, Bill. Next up is Joe, followed by Marco. Joe, go ahead.
Hi, Bill. Thank you. Thank you for presenting. It's a big step up from last week's presentation. But
I object to that. That's very unfair to the president.
Sure that's not the case.
But no, I appreciate this a lot. Is this chapter, and when we went through this the first time together, is this really about going against conventional wisdom in order to become wise, as a way of thinking about how maybe approaching this week is that conventionally thinking maybe the idea of happiness being the goal, and whereas no, happiness isn't the goal, it is a subset of being virtuous. So it's something that actually is just, being virtuous is our priority, and then being happy is a result of that. Is that a proper way of thinking about this particular week?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think that's a valid way of thinking about it, because, the Stoics believe that virtue is really all you need for happiness. And before Stoicism, I really never thought of happiness in that fashion. So yes, it's definitely not the normal way people think about happiness.
Okay. And thank you, Joe, for leading last time. Really appreciate that. Next up is Marco, followed by Dan. Marco, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to the comment that was made about Stoicism and happiness. And I think it was just mentioned right beforehand. But basically, like, what I learned from the reading is that happiness is different for everyone, and basically it just means, like, maybe from the Stoic approach, is that you're just lining up your life with your values, and your values are being met, and that's it.
Okay, yeah, that's the idea, I believe. Your happiness does have a lot to do with your values. Your values and virtues, there's an interrelationship between them. And, so happiness is about living your values, being virtuous.
Next up is Dan, followed by Sana. Dan, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for the example, Bill. Earlier, you talked about spiders as a possible fear. I'm thinking that sometimes pushing yourself to can have different results. Instead of overcoming a fear, it might be realizing a better self-image, like, oh, I can pass calculus, or I can pass my real estate license, or whatever. Does this lead us, these different results, overcoming fears or changing self-image, does this lead to another Stoic tool or another way of explaining this? How would you say?
I'm not sure. Can you, like, I'm not sure I got that, the question.
Oh, well, I related in my departments, you might say, in my mind, is I think about it like amor fati. Once you realize not only do you have difficulties to deal with in the world, if you embrace all your fate, amor fati, then you go like a step further and you realize that this is always coming at you. Difficulties are always coming down the road. And with this example, pushing yourself, if you realize maybe the next level is that there are all sorts of good things waiting for you, shedding your fears or changing your self-image, maybe there's, how would we describe that next level? Or is that just something that we can look forward to as Stoics?
Yeah, okay, well, if I understand you, I think so, yes, for sure. So you mentioned amor fati, so the idea of sort of loving what happens to us, or at least being able to willingly and fully accept it or consent to it, that kind of thing, is really, I consider that, you know, a high level of consciousness or application of virtue. You know, you've got to the stage where, in a sense, you know, how we talk about desire and aversion. Well, and I think Epictetus has a quote about this when he says, "Don't hope that things happen as you." Well, let me. You probably know the quote I'm talking about.
Rather as they do happen.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So yeah, I mean, that's definitely a high level of acceptance of all the things that we encounter every day without disturbing ourselves about it.
Thank you.
So for sure, yeah.
Next up is Sana, Francoise, and Leslie. Sana, go ahead.
Yes, hi. I'm gonna take this philosophy a bit towards Eastern a little bit and talk about Buddhism in that context. I believe that the suffering that the Buddha talked about is this unsatisfaction where you are. So us as a human beings, when we are in one direction, we always get saturated with that direction and we feel unsatisfied. So when we change directions by doing the opposite, we opened a new avenue. And that avenue, after a while, we will reach that also saturating and dissatisfaction. And that's when we turn again to do the opposite. And the life of the Buddha, when he went from extreme wealth to extreme poverty, and he wasn't happy in either, but in this transition, in that journey, he reached the middle way, the middle path, and he became more satisfied. So it's like the law of diminishing returns. When you understand that, you know that whatever you're doing, whatever brings you pleasure, one day won't. So when you understand that, you go through another path. And so basically, it's a journey of growth. And that's what happiness is. As long as you're growing and shifting between one path to the opposite, that's the journey that gives you satisfaction. Thank you.
Okay, yeah. Yes, yeah, thank you for that. I think that was, you know, a beautiful way to look at it.
Thank you, Sana. Next up is Francoise, followed by Leslie.
Hi, Bill. I'm trying to express what I have in mind, because I'm wondering the position of the Stoic facing the conflicts which may oppose the consideration of a virtue. Like, if I give you an example and I take courage, you could have the courage to go to war, You know, you have to be courageous and go to war. But you can also have that same courage not to go to war because you don't want to kill people. So when you have such opposite, you know, what is the position and the look for the right thing to do?
Well, the way I look at a question like that, and it's certainly an important one, is this is where I suppose your values and reason come in. I mean, because, you know, when Stoics talk about courage or any other virtue, and other people may, you know, understand this better than me, but there's no like dogma in terms of what constitutes courage in every situation. You know, it can be different depending on your makeup, your value. I mean, there's certain basic principles that are, you know, that are part of Stoicism, but how it may be applied in each situation could differ. Like some person could be against violence, they could be nonviolent, and perhaps they're called upon to join the military, but they do not do that. They exercise courage because that would go against, you know, their belief in nonviolence. You could also have someone who believes in what their country is doing and believes that they should stand up for certain rights or certain principles that are represented in terms of the reason their country is going to war. And this person may have the, you know, exercise courage to join in, you know, with the military and fight for his country. So there's not an absolute answer to that. It depends on each person's values, makeup, situation, the circumstances. And I think that's one reason why rationality and reason is so prominent in Stoicism, because these are things that we have to think about for ourselves to come to our own conclusion and decision about.
Next up is Leslie, and then we're going to talk about the breakout rooms. Leslie, go ahead.
Thanks. I was thinking about virtue as people might use the pursuit of virtue as a means to arrive at happiness. Other people might use pursuit of virtue as the means of achieving virtue. Is virtue the means or is it the goal? And I think about health. When people just strive to lose weight to look better, they don't stick with it. They lose their 10 pounds, they gain it back. When people are committed to exercise and eating well for their health, they stay thin and healthy for decades. And so I'm just wondering, do you find that people who pursue virtue for its own sake are more successful and happier than people who pursue virtue as a path to become happy?
Yeah, excellent question. So the idea is to pursue virtue for its own sake. You know, the idea of virtue is its own reward, that type of thing. So virtue has a lot to do with a person's motivation. So, you know, two people can do the same thing, like get in shape, you know, exercise. And one person's motivation would be to, you know, they want to be in good shape so they can do things for, you know, for others. You know, they want to be able to have a healthy life so they can use their health so that they're in good condition to, you know, do good things, do good work, so to speak. Another person may want good health so they, you know, look better, so they're more attractive or something along those lines. So they're even though they on the surface they may be doing the same thing, their motivation is different. So in the first instance, I would say, their health is related to their virtue. But in the second instance, I would say that's not the case because their motivation is not really virtuous. Is there anything else to that?
I would, let me add a couple more things.
Yeah.
I think there are two, there is a dramatic difference between virtue ethics and value ethics. Ethics, which is based, which holds that what you're really doing is that you're trying to achieve values, versus an ethic where it's like you pursue ethic by pursuing virtues. That's the fundamental thing you focus on. And clearly, Stoics are, Stoicism is a virtue ethic. It's all about doing the right thing. They're very explicit about it. The values, even kind of positive, or they call it indifference, in the sense that it doesn't really relate to whether you are being virtuous. So virtue as being kind of the prime mover of actually, prime mover of morality is what I would say. And all the results kind of depend on other factors, which you may or may not, which you do not fully control. So it's definitely kind of focused on virtue ethics. Bill, would you like to add anything to it, or shall we go ahead and describe the breakout rooms?
Yeah, I suppose we can go describe.
Okay, so Bill, what exercise are people going to do in the breakout rooms?
Okay, so this exercise is putting this idea of acting the opposite into practice. So the first step in the exercise is to kind of think about what your desires and aversions are, and things that you can safely do that are different than you are doing, how you can act the opposite. And for this exercise, the idea is to stick to things that are not, really significant, what they call mild to moderate pleasures and desires, that kind of thing. I'll give some examples in a moment. But anyway, so the idea is you plan for the coming week by listing an exercise each day of something that you'll act the opposite of, where you will intentionally do something different than you have been doing. And so if you desire one thing, I'll use the ice cream example again. If it's your normal practice to desire a lot of ice cream, you'll act the opposite of that and do something else. Maybe drink a glass of cold water or something if you feel hot. Something along those lines. You'll come up with something else to do that's the opposite of that desire. So in the example in the book, they have a chart with an example of how this works. So in one example was, I guess, Asha, who we were talking about before. She likes the latest designs and whatnot. So her desire listed in this chart is to go window shopping. In the first column of the chart, she writes down window shopping. And then in the second column, she writes what she normally does. She leaves work at 6, and that's when she will institute doing the opposite of what she has been doing. So in the next third column, instead of writing what she would normally do, which was window shop, by walking, she used to go down Madison Avenue. I suppose Madison Avenue in New York must be an avenue with lots of shops and whatnot. But instead of doing that, where she's exposed to all these stores and everything, she'll take another route, which would be a route that doesn't have her going past all these shops and stores where she can shop. And then the last step is to make an assessment as to whether it's safe for her to do this and whether it's challenging enough. The idea is that it shouldn't be too hard or shouldn't be too easy either. The next example might make that more clear. So in the next example, there's a person who has the habit of saying yes to please people, right? And the example that they give here is someone asks him to take on more work. His usual response is to agree with that, even though it's very difficult for him to take on more work and presumably doesn't really want to do that. So the opposite action that he will describe is when someone asks him to do more work or to take on more work, he'll say, no, there's too much on my plate right now. So he'll act the opposite by not agreeing to take on more work and saying no. And then he'll evaluate whether that's something realistic for him to do, whether it's safe. And he says yes, as long as it's not his main job. I suppose if his boss asks him to do something, you know, he probably will need to do that. But if it's not that, if it's something on the side, as he describes it, he can say no and not do it. And he feels that that is sufficiently challenging for him to make progress in this area. So that's kind of the exercise.
Okay, let's just ask now, folks, do you have any questions about what you need to do in the breakout rooms? You just need to identify things that you want to change. Then you have to identify what action you are going to take, which is different, and then you're going to evaluate it. Does anybody have any question about what you need to do in the breakout room? Okay, nope. So I'm going to start the breakout rooms. Give me just a second. So the breakout rooms will run for 25 minutes. And after 25 minutes, we'll automatically come into this room so we can discuss our takeaways.